The date was September 4, 476 AD. In the northern Italian city of Ravenna, inside a cold stone palace that smelled of damp wool and burnt oil, a 16-year-old boy sat on a throne that no longer meant anything. His name was Romulus Augustulus, a name that carried the full weight of Roman mythology. Romulus, the legendary founder who had built the first walls of Rome more than 12 centuries earlier. Augustus, the brilliant general who had transformed a crumbling republic into the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Two names, two giants of history, and yet the boy who bore them both could do nothing but stare at the floor as a tall, broad-shouldered man with a German accent walked toward him holding a document. The man's name was Odoacer. He was the leader of the Heruli, a Germanic tribe that had been serving in the Roman army for decades, as mercenaries, as soldiers for hire, as men who fought under the Roman eagle but had never truly believed in it. Now Odoacer stood in the center of the imperial palace. And he was not asking for a promotion or a salary increase. He was asking for the throne. Romulus Augustulus signed the document. No battle, no fire, no dramatic last stand on the walls of Rome, just a quill touching parchment, and 500 years of the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. What happened next was perhaps even more telling than the abdication itself. Odoacer did not execute the boy emperor. He did not parade him through the streets in chains, the way Roman generals had once displayed defeated kings from Gaul, from Egypt, from Judea. Instead, Odoacer sent Romulus to a comfortable villa on the Bay of Naples, the Castellum Lucullanum, a fortress overlooking the blue Tyrrhenian Sea, and granted him a generous annual pension of 6,000 gold pieces. The boy lived out his days in relative peace. He was, in the end, irrelevant, a symbol of something that had already died long before he was born. That is the question at the heart of this story. Not what happened on September 4, 476. That date is just the paperwork, the official timestamp on a death certificate for something that had been dying for centuries. The real question is, how does the most powerful empire in the history of the Western world collapse? How does a civilization that built roads still in use today, that invented concrete, that gave us our calendar, our legal system, our alphabet, how does something like that simply stop existing? The answer is not simple. And it is not comfortable. Because the fall of Rome was not caused by one catastrophic event. It was not one lost battle, one plague, one bad emperor. It was the accumulation of hundreds of small failures over nearly 300 years. Each one weakening the foundation just a little more. Each one making the next failure slightly more likely. Until the entire structure, political, military, economic, cultural, gave way all at once. To understand how it fell, you first had to understand what it was at its height. At its peak under Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD, the Roman Empire stretched across 5.5 million square kilometers of territory. That is roughly the size of the entire continental United States. Its borders ran from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, a stone barrier stretching 117 kilometers across the width of England, built to keep out the unconquered tribes of Scotland, all the way east to the borders of the Parthian Empire in what is now Iraq and Iran. From the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north, which formed a natural defensive line across Central Europe, south to the endless sands of the Sahara Desert in North Africa. The Mediterranean Sea sat at the center of all of it. The Romans called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. And it genuinely was. Every coastline, every port, every island in that sea belonged to Rome. Grain from Egypt and North Africa fed the city of Rome itself, which at its peak held over 1 million people, a population density that no European city would match again until London in the 19th century. Timber from the forests of Gaul and Germany built the fleets that kept trade moving across those waters. Silver from the mines of Spain filled the imperial treasury. Silk and spices from as far away as India and China arrived through Roman trading posts in Syria and Egypt. The Roman army made all of this possible. At full strength, Rome maintained approximately 30 legions, each one containing around 5,000 heavily armored infantry soldiers, supported by cavalry, engineers, and auxiliary troops. In total, roughly 400,000 professional soldiers guarded the borders of the empire. These were not conscripted peasants handed a spear and told to march. They were career soldiers who enlisted for 25 years, trained relentlessly, and were paid a regular salary at a time when most people in the ancient world worked the land for subsistence. A Roman legionary was also an engineer, a road builder, a surveyor. When a legion marched into new territory, it did not simply occupy the land, it transformed it. Within weeks, a Roman military camp would become a town. Within years, that town would have stone buildings, running water, a forum, and a bathhouse. The Roman legal system was the intellectual foundation of everything. The idea that every citizen deserved equal treatment under a written law, regardless of wealth or social status, at least in principle, was radical for its time. Roman jurists developed legal concepts still embedded in the laws of dozens of modern nations: the presumption of innocence, the right to face your accuser, the distinction between civil and criminal offenses, the concept of legal personhood for organizations. When you watch a courtroom drama today, when a defense lawyer argues that the prosecution has not met its burden of proof, you are watching a tradition that runs in an unbroken line back to the forums of ancient Rome. This was the empire that was supposed to last forever. The Romans themselves believed it was eternal. They called their city the Urbs Eterna, the eternal city. Their poets wrote of Rome's destiny to rule the world without end. The historian Livy, writing during the reign of Augustus, spoke of Rome as a city whose founding had been blessed by the gods and whose future had no horizon. For a people who had watched their legions march from one end of the known world to the other, who had seen barbarian kings kneel before the Senate, who had turned the Mediterranean into an inland lake, the idea that any of this could simply end was genuinely unthinkable. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what made the collapse so devastating when it finally came. The most dangerous illusion in history is the belief that what is powerful today will always be powerful. That what works now will always work. That size and momentum are the same thing as permanence. The Romans fell partly because they could not imagine falling, and so they ignored the warning signs, explained away the symptoms, promoted the incompetent, depleted the treasury, and kept patching a structure that needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. By the time anyone truly understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. So where did the cracks first appear? The answer takes us back to the year 180 AD, the death of one emperor and the beginning of a slow catastrophe that would take nearly 3 centuries to complete. Chapter 1: The Last Good Emperor and the First Crack. On March 17, 180 AD, in a military camp somewhere along the Danube River, historians still debate the exact location, with the most likely candidates being Vindobona, the settlement that would one day become Vienna, or Sirmium in modern-day Serbia. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius closed his eyes for the last time. He was 58 years old. He had ruled the Roman Empire for 19 years, and by almost every measure that history uses to judge the men who held supreme power, he was the best emperor Rome ever produced. Marcus Aurelius was not supposed to be a warrior. He was a philosopher, a student of Stoicism, the Greek school of thought that taught self-discipline, rational thinking, and the acceptance of things beyond your control. He spent his private hours writing in a personal journal that he never intended anyone to read. A collection of reflections and self-admonishments that survived by accident and that we now know as the Meditations. In those pages, Marcus wrote about the importance of humility, about the duty to serve others, about the futility of ego and ambition. You have power over your mind, not outside events. He wrote, "Realize this, and you will find strength." These were not the words of a man who wanted an empire. These were the words of a man trying to survive having won. Yet Marcus Aurelius spent almost his entire reign at war. The empire he inherited in 161 AD was already under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. In the east, the Parthian Empire, the powerful Persian state that was Rome's only true rival in terms of organization and military strength, invaded the Roman province of Syria and destroyed an entire Roman legion at the Battle of Elegia. In the north, along the long Danube frontier that stretched across what is now Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Romania, the Germanic tribes that Rome had kept at bay for generations were pressing harder against the border. The Marcomanni and Quadi tribes, in particular, were not the disorganized raiders of earlier centuries. They were confederacies, groups of tribes that had learned, partly by watching Rome itself, that coordinated action was far more effective than individual raids. Marcus spent the better part of a decade fighting these northern tribes in what historians call the Marcomannic Wars. He did not want to be on the Danube frontier. He wanted to be in Rome, reading, thinking, governing through diplomacy and law. But the empire demanded his presence on the battlefield. And so he went, and he was effective. By the time of his death, the northern frontier had been stabilized. The Germanic tribes had been pushed back. Roman territory was intact. But Marcus Aurelius made one decision in his final years that historians have debated ever since. A decision that some argue set the entire collapse in motion. He chose his own son as his successor. The son's name was Commodus. He was 18 years old when his father died. Physically impressive, tall, broad-chested, with the kind of looks that Roman portrait sculptors loved, and catastrophically unsuited for imperial power. Where Marcus had been disciplined, Commodus was impulsive. Where Marcus had been self-critical, Commodus was pathologically self-aggrandizing. Within a few years of taking power, Commodus had renamed the city of Rome after himself, calling it Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, and declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules, the demigod son of Jupiter. He appeared in the Colosseum to fight as a gladiator, which to Roman aristocratic sensibility was roughly equivalent to a modern head of state insisting on performing as a circus clown at official state functions. He killed animals by the hundreds in staged hunts. He fought human opponents who were, for obvious reasons, not permitted to actually wound him, and declared himself the victor of thousands of contests. The senators despised him. The army generals grew frustrated. The imperial administration, which had run smoothly under Marcus Aurelius, began to fracture as Commodus paid less and less attention to actual governance and more attention to his own glorification. On December 31, 192 AD, a small group of conspirators, including his own mistress, Marcia, and the Praetorian prefect, the commander of the elite guard unit responsible for the emperor's personal protection, had Commodus strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus. His reign had lasted 12 years and produced almost nothing of lasting value except this: it demonstrated, for the first time in nearly a century, that the Roman emperor could be removed by anyone with enough determination and access. That lesson would be learned, and relearned, with catastrophic consequences. What followed the death of Commodus was a preview of disasters yet to come. In 193 AD, a year that historians call the Year of the Five Emperors, because 5 different men claimed the imperial throne within 12 months, the fundamental weakness of the Roman political system was exposed with brutal clarity. Rome had never developed a reliable, institutionalized method for transferring power. There was no constitution that specified what happened when an emperor died. No electoral system, no legally defined line of succession that everyone agreed to follow. Power went to whoever could seize it and hold it. In practice, that meant power went to whoever had the loyalty of the most legions. This created a problem that would eventually prove fatal. The Roman army was spread across the entire empire, stationed at the frontiers, on the Rhine, on the Danube, in Syria, in North Africa, in Britain. Each frontier had its own commander, its own legions, its own local identity and loyalties. When there was a strong emperor in Rome, those commanders followed orders, but when the throne was contested, each frontier commander had both the motive and the means to declare his own man emperor. The legions on the Rhine preferred a different candidate than the legions on the Danube, who preferred a different candidate than the legions in Syria. And since the only way to resolve these disputes was military force, the result was Roman soldiers fighting Roman soldiers on Roman soil, a waste of men, money, and military capacity that the empire could afford periodically but could not afford indefinitely. The 3rd century AD, which historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, saw this dynamic reach its logical extreme. Between 235 and 284 AD, a period of just 49 years, the Roman Empire had at least 26 different emperors. Some historians count more, depending on how you define the term. The average reign lasted less than 2 years. Most of these emperors did not die of old age. They were assassinated, killed in battle, or simply abandoned by their troops when a more promising candidate appeared. The empire fractured. At one point in the 260s AD, there were simultaneously 3 separate claimants to the Roman throne, each controlling different regions, each issuing their own coins, each fighting the others while also trying to defend their own frontiers against external enemies. During these same decades, the external pressures on the empire intensified dramatically. In the east, the Parthian Empire collapsed and was replaced by something far more aggressive, the Sassanid Persian Empire, which came to power in 224 AD with a clear imperial ideology that explicitly sought to restore the old Persian Empire of Cyrus and Darius, which had once stretched from Egypt to India. The Sassanids were militarily sophisticated, administratively competent, and deeply motivated. In 260 AD, in one of the most shocking moments in Roman military history, the Sassanid king Shapur I defeated and captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle, the only time in Roman history that a reigning emperor was taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. Shapur commemorated the moment by carving a massive rock relief at Niqosh-i-Rostam in modern Iran, which still exists today, showing the humiliated Roman emperor kneeling before the Persian king. Along the Rhine and Danube, the Germanic tribes had reorganized themselves into larger, more cohesive confederacies, the Alemanni in the southwest, the Franks in the northwest, the Goths along the lower Danube. These were no longer the small, loosely organized bands of raiders that Julius Caesar had described 3 centuries earlier. They had been transformed by centuries of contact with Rome, absorbing Roman military techniques, Roman organizational methods, sometimes Roman officers who had defected or been captured. They were, in many ways, Rome's most dangerous students. The empire survived the 3rd century, but only barely, and only at enormous cost. The man who pulled it back from the edge of complete disintegration was Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284 AD and ruled until 305, an unusually long and stable reign by the standards of his time. Diocletian was a military commander of exceptional ability and a political administrator of ruthless pragmatism. He understood that the empire as it had been structured under Augustus, one man ruling everything from Rome, was no longer functional. The territory was too vast, the threats too numerous, the communication too slow. A crisis on the Rhine took weeks to reach Rome. By the time an imperial response was organized and dispatched, the situation on the ground had changed completely. Diocletian's solution was radical. He split the empire into 2 administrative halves, East and West, each with its own emperor and its own junior co-emperor. 4 rulers instead of 1. The system was called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. In theory, it was an elegant solution to the problem of imperial overreach. In practice, it planted the seed of a division that would eventually become permanent. It also required money, enormous, staggering amounts of money. Maintaining 4 imperial courts, 4 imperial armies, 4 sets of frontier defenses, 4 bureaucracies, all of it cost far more than the old single emperor system. And the Roman treasury, depleted by decades of civil war and military spending, did not have it. So the Roman government did what governments throughout history have done when they spend more than they earn. They debased the currency. The silver denarius, the standard Roman coin that had been the backbone of Mediterranean commerce for centuries, had been approximately 90% pure silver during the reign of Augustus. By the time of the crisis of the 3rd century, the silver content had dropped to roughly 5%. The coins looked the same. They had the emperor's face on them, the same inscriptions, the same size and weight, but they were not the same. Merchants knew it, soldiers knew it, farmers knew it. Prices rose to compensate for the devaluation, which meant the coins bought less, which meant the government needed to issue more coins to pay its bills, which caused prices to rise further. It was an inflationary spiral, ancient Rome's version of a financial crisis, and it eroded the economic stability that the empire depended on just as surely as any barbarian invasion. By the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was still standing. Its borders, more or less, held. Its cities still functioned. Its roads still carried goods and soldiers. But something fundamental had shifted. The confident, expansive, seemingly invincible civilization that had built the Colosseum and conquered Britain and turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake was gone. What remained was something more defensive, more anxious, more expensive to maintain, and far more fragile than it appeared from the outside. The machine was still running, but the parts were wearing out, and no one had figured out how to replace them. Chapter 2, Constantine, Christianity, and the split that changed everything. In the early hours of October 28, 312 AD, two Roman armies faced each other across the Tiber River just north of Rome, at a narrow crossing called the Milvian Bridge. On one side stood Maxentius, the emperor who controlled Rome and Italy, a man who had ruled for 6 years through a combination of military force, political maneuvering, and sheer stubbornness. He had an army of roughly 75,000 men. He had the walls of Rome behind him, walls that had never been breached by any enemy. He had the Praetorian Guard, the elite imperial bodyguard unit that had been the kingmakers of Roman politics for 2 centuries. By every conventional military calculation, Maxentius should have stayed inside those walls and waited. Instead, for reasons that historians still debate, perhaps overconfidence, perhaps a misread oracle, perhaps simple miscalculation, he marched his army out across the bridge to meet his enemy in open battle. On the other side stood Constantine, the son of a former emperor, who had spent the previous 6 years building his power base in Britain and Gaul. He had marched his army over the Alps in late summer, defeated Maxentius's forces in several engagements across northern Italy, and now stood within reach of Rome itself. His army was smaller, perhaps 40,000 men. But Constantine had something that Maxentius lacked. He had momentum, he had a reputation for winning, and according to accounts written years after the battle, he had something else entirely. A vision. The story, as recorded by the historian Eusebius of Caesarea, who claimed to have heard it directly from Constantine himself, goes like this. On the eve of the battle, Constantine looked up at the sun and saw a cross of light above it, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer," written in Greek across the sky. That night, he dreamed that Christ appeared to him and instructed him to put the Christian symbol on his soldiers' shields. Constantine obeyed. His soldiers marched into battle bearing the Chi Rho, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek, overlaid into a single symbol, on their equipment. They won, decisively. Maxentius's army was pushed back to the river. The bridge, which had been partially dismantled to slow Constantine's advance, collapsed under the weight of the retreating soldiers. Maxentius himself fell into the Tiber River in full armor and drowned. His body was pulled from the water the next day, his head cut off and paraded through the streets of Rome on a spear. Constantine entered the city as its undisputed master. Whether Constantine genuinely converted to Christianity out of sincere belief, or whether he saw in the new religion a powerful unifying force that could hold his fractured empire together, or whether the vision at the Milvian Bridge was a real experience, a calculated piece of political theater, or simply a story that grew more elaborate with each retelling, none of that can be known with certainty. What can be known is what Constantine did next, and the consequences of those actions stretch far beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, reaching forward across 17 centuries to shape the world we live in today. In 313 AD, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan. Before this moment, Christianity had been at best tolerated and at worst actively persecuted within the Roman Empire. The faith had been spreading for nearly 3 centuries, beginning in the small Roman province of Judea with the teachings of a Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth, spreading through the trade networks and road systems of the empire, gathering followers among the poor, the enslaved, women, merchants, and eventually soldiers and educated elites. By the early 4th century, Christians probably made up somewhere between 10 and 15% of the empire's population, a significant minority, though still far from a majority. The Edict of Milan did not make Christianity the official state religion. What it did was simpler and more immediately profound. It granted religious tolerance to all religions within the empire, explicitly including Christianity, and ordered that property previously confiscated from Christian communities be returned. For the first time in Roman history, Christians could worship openly without fear of arrest, torture, or execution. Constantine went further. He funded the construction of Christian churches across the empire, including the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, built over what tradition identified as the tomb of the Apostle Peter. He gave the Christian clergy the same legal privileges and tax exemptions previously enjoyed by pagan priests. He moved his imperial capital away from Rome, a city saturated with the temples, traditions, and political culture of the old pagan order, and founded an entirely new city on the site of the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium. At the narrow strait connecting Europe and Asia, he named it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Today it is called Istanbul. This relocation of the imperial capital was not simply a geographical decision. It was a statement about where the center of gravity of the Roman world was shifting. The new city sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, perfectly positioned to control the trade routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Between the wealthy eastern provinces and the struggling western ones, Constantinople was easier to defend than Rome, surrounded on three sides by water. Accessible by land only through a narrow peninsula that could be fortified with walls. It was also, by Constantine's deliberate design, a Christian city from its foundation. There were no ancient pagan temples here. No centuries-old religious traditions to compete with or navigate around. It was a clean start. What Constantine created, whether he fully understood it or not, was a tale of two empires. The eastern half, centered on Constantinople, encompassing Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and the wealthy trading cities of the eastern Mediterranean, was prosperous. Densely populated, highly urbanized, and economically dynamic, its cities were ancient, sophisticated, and rich. Alexandria in Egypt was one of the greatest centers of learning in the world. Antioch in Syria was a commercial hub connecting Rome to the silk and spice routes of Asia. The eastern provinces produced grain, olive oil, glass, textiles, and luxury goods in quantities that made them the economic engine of the entire empire. The western half, encompassing Italy, Gaul, Britain, Spain, and North Africa, was comparatively poorer, more rural, more sparsely populated, and more exposed to the Germanic tribes pressing against the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Its cities, while still impressive by ancient standards, were smaller and less economically dynamic than their eastern counterparts. Its tax base was narrower. Its agricultural production, while substantial, could not match the output of the fertile Nile Delta or the irrigated fields of Syria. After Constantine's death in 337 AD, the empire was divided among his sons, reunited briefly, divided again, and then in 395 AD. After the death of Emperor Theodosius I, the last man to rule the whole empire alone, it was permanently split into two separate political entities. The Western Roman Empire, ruled from cities like Milan and Ravenna rather than Rome itself, which had become too exposed to be a practical capital, and the Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, which would survive for another 1,000 years, eventually becoming what historians call the Byzantine Empire, before finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. But in the late 4th century, that eastern survival was not yet guaranteed, and the West was already in serious trouble. The reason brings us back to money, and to a problem that Constantine's reign had made significantly worse even as it solved others. Maintaining a Christian empire required resources that a pagan empire had not needed. Church construction was expensive. The clergy required support. The elaborate theological councils that Constantine convened to resolve disputes within the Christian community, most famously the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where hundreds of bishops gathered from across the empire to debate the precise nature of Christ's relationship to God. All of this cost money. More significantly, the ongoing theological disputes within Christianity, which produced fierce and sometimes violent conflicts between different factions, consumed enormous political energy that might otherwise have been directed at the practical business of governing a vast empire under increasing external pressure. At the same time, the army that defended that empire was changing in ways that would have alarmed the generals of earlier centuries. Since at least the 3rd century, the Roman military had been increasingly reliant on Germanic soldiers, warriors recruited from the tribes along the frontiers. Either as individuals seeking Roman pay and citizenship, or as entire units serving under their own commanders within the Roman military structure. By the late 4th century, this process had accelerated dramatically. Germanic soldiers made up a substantial portion of the Roman army, and Germanic commanders had risen to some of the highest military positions in the empire. Men with names like Stilicho and Aetius and Arbogast, names that would have sounded foreign and barbaric to the ears of Scipio or Caesar, now commanded Roman legions, planned Roman campaigns, and in some cases effectively ran the Western imperial government while a series of weak child emperors sat on the throne and signed documents. This was not, in itself, a fatal problem. Empires throughout history have successfully incorporated outsiders into their military and administrative structures. What made it dangerous in Rome's case was the specific context: a weakening economy, a shrinking tax base, a political system that had never solved the succession problem, and a set of frontiers that were under more sustained pressure than at any point since the Second Punic War. When Hannibal had marched his elephants over the Alps and brought Rome to the edge of extinction 5 centuries earlier, the pressure on those frontiers was about to become something entirely different. Because out on the great grasslands east of the Caspian Sea, far beyond the Rhine and the Danube, beyond even the Sassanid Persian Empire, something was moving. A people that the Romans had heard of only in vague, second-hand accounts from Eastern traders. A people who lived entirely on horseback, who could ride and shoot with a composite bow simultaneously, whose cavalry moved with a speed and coordination that no infantry-based army could match or outrun. A people whose sudden westward movement across the Eurasian steppe in the 370s AD would set in motion a chain reaction that crashed through the Gothic tribes on the Danube frontier like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Their name was the Huns, and their arrival would transform the manageable pressure on Rome's borders into something the Western Empire simply did not have the resources, the political unity, or the military strength to survive. Chapter 3: The Huns, the Goths, and the day Rome's myth died. They came from the east like nothing anyone in the Roman world had ever seen. The Huns were not a civilization in the way Rome understood that word. They had no cities, no stone buildings, no written language, no fixed borders. What they had was horses, and a relationship with horses so complete, so total, that the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the late 4th century, struggled to find words adequate to describe it. He wrote that the Huns seemed to be permanently attached to their animals, that they ate on horseback, conducted negotiations on horseback, slept on horseback, and that when you saw a group of them dismounted and walking on foot, they seemed awkward and diminished, like creatures out of their natural element. Their bowed legs, shaped by a lifetime in the saddle, made them look ungainly on the ground. But on a horse, moving at full gallop, firing arrows backward over their shoulder at a target 50 meters behind them with enough force to punch through iron armor, on a horse, they were something that the Roman military establishment had no tactical answer for. Where exactly the Huns originated remains a matter of historical debate. Some historians connect them to the Xiongnu, a nomadic confederation that had terrorized the northern borders of China for centuries, prompting the construction of the Great Wall. Others argue they were a distinct people from the Central Asian steppe. What is clear is that sometime in the 350s and 360s AD, the Huns began moving westward across the vast grasslands north of the Caspian Sea, pushing through the territories of the Alans, a nomadic Iranian people, and then driving into the lands of the Goths. The Goths were themselves a Germanic people who had settled north of the Danube River over the previous century, in the region historians call Gothia, roughly corresponding to modern-day Romania and Ukraine. They were not the disorganized raiders of earlier Roman nightmares. The Goths had developed a settled, agricultural society with its own aristocracy, its own laws, and a significant Christian population. Gothic missionaries had translated the Bible into the Gothic language decades earlier, making it one of the first Germanic languages to have a written form. The Goths had fought Rome, traded with Rome, served in Roman armies, and in many ways been shaped by centuries of contact with Roman civilization. They were, by the standards of the late 4th century, a relatively sophisticated people, The Huns destroyed their world in a matter of years. Sometime around 375 AD, the Hunnic cavalry swept through Gothia with a speed and ferocity that the Gothic military could not withstand. Gothic armies that met the Huns in open battle were shattered. The Hunnic tactics, fast-moving cavalry that never stood still long enough to be engaged decisively, that retreated when pressed and attacked when pursued, that could cover distances in a day that infantry armies covered in a week, were simply outside the experience of Gothic warriors trained for a different kind of warfare. Gothic villages burned. Gothic aristocrats fled. The entire Gothic people, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children, were set into motion. They ran toward Rome. In the late summer of 376 AD, an enormous mass of Gothic people, the Visigoths, the western branch of the Gothic nation, led by chieftains named Alivivus and Fritigern, appeared on the northern bank of the Danube River and asked, through messengers sent to the Roman commanders on the southern bank, for permission to cross. They wanted to enter Roman territory. They wanted Roman protection from the Huns. In exchange, they offered to serve in the Roman army and to settle as farmers on the depopulated agricultural lands of the Roman Balkans, which had been devastated by decades of plague and war and desperately needed working hands. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens, not to be confused with the earlier Emperor Valerian who had been captured by the Persians, was in Antioch at the time, preparing for a campaign against the Sassanid Persians. When the request arrived, he saw in it not a threat but an opportunity. More soldiers for his army. More farmers for his depleted tax base. He granted permission for the Visigoths to cross. What happened next was one of the great administrative catastrophes in Roman history. And it turned a manageable refugee crisis into the spark that ignited a war. The Roman officials responsible for receiving and resettling the Goths were corrupt. This was not unusual. Corruption was endemic in the late Roman bureaucracy. A symptom of a system under severe financial stress where underpaid officials supplemented their income through bribery and extortion. But the timing could not have been worse. The Roman commanders Lupicinus and Maximus charged the Gothic refugees enormous prices for food they were obligated by the terms of the agreement to provide. When the Goths ran out of valuables to trade, the Romans reportedly accepted Gothic children as slaves in exchange for dog meat. Gothic families who had crossed the Danube to escape annihilation by the Huns found themselves being systematically stripped of everything they owned by the people who were supposed to protect them. The Goths endured this treatment for months. Then, in early 377 AD, at a banquet held by the Roman commander Lupicinus at the city of Marcianople in what is now Bulgaria, a brawl broke out between Gothic and Roman soldiers outside the walls. Lupicinus, apparently drunk and panicking, ordered the Gothic chieftains attending the banquet to be arrested. Fritigern, one of the leaders, managed to escape. He returned to his people with a simple message: the Romans had betrayed them. There would be no peaceful settlement. The only option left was war. The Goths rose in rebellion. For the next year and a half, a Roman army struggled to contain a Gothic force that knew the terrain, had nothing to lose, and had been joined by other groups, Hunnic and Alan warriors who had crossed the Danube seeking plunder. Runaway slaves from Roman estates who saw an opportunity for freedom, and other Germanic groups who smelled Roman weakness and decided to press their advantage. The Romans won some engagements and lost others. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow. Then, in the summer of 378 AD, Emperor Valens made a decision that would end his life and permanently alter the course of Western history. Valens was at Adrianople, a city in what is now northwestern Turkey, just across the European border, with a Roman army of perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 men. His co-emperor Gratian, who ruled the western half of the empire, was marching to reinforce him with additional troops. The Gothic forces were camped nearby, their wagons arranged in a defensive circle on a hillside. Scouts reported that the Gothic army numbered perhaps 10,000 warriors, significantly smaller than Valens's force. Those scouts were wrong. The bulk of the Gothic cavalry, thousands of horsemen who had been out foraging when the Roman army arrived, was not yet on the field. Fritigern knew this, and he played for time, sending negotiators to delay the Roman attack while he waited for his cavalry to return. Valens, impatient and perhaps motivated by the desire to win a decisive victory before Gratian arrived and had to share in the glory, refused to wait. On August 9, 378 AD, he ordered his army to attack. The Roman infantry marched uphill in the August heat toward the Gothic wagon circle. It was a brutal approach, the sun was fierce, the ground was rough, and the Roman soldiers had been marching all day without food or water. As they engaged the Gothic infantry at the wagon line, the Gothic cavalry suddenly appeared on their flanks, returning from their foraging expedition at exactly the wrong moment from the Roman perspective and exactly the right moment from Fritigern's. What followed was a slaughter. The Roman cavalry on the right flank broke and fled almost immediately, leaving the Roman infantry exposed on three sides. The Gothic cavalry drove into the Roman flanks and rear while the Gothic infantry held the front. The Roman formation, the tight, disciplined line that had been the foundation of Roman tactical success for centuries, collapsed. Men who could not retreat because the press of bodies behind them was too great were cut down where they stood. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who was a contemporary and possibly an eyewitness to the aftermath, described the battlefield as so choked with dead men that there was no room to fall. He compared the scale of the disaster to the Battle of Cannae, the worst defeat in Roman history. When Hannibal had annihilated a Roman army of similar size more than 5 centuries earlier. 2/3 of the Roman army at Adrianople was destroyed. Somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 Roman soldiers died on that hillside in a single afternoon. Among the dead was Emperor Valens himself. His body was never found. Some accounts say he was killed in the fighting and his body simply lost in the mass of dead. Others say he was wounded, carried to a nearby farmhouse, and burned alive when the Goths set fire to the building, not knowing the emperor was inside. The Battle of Adrianople on August 9, 378 AD was not the end of the Roman Empire. There would be another century of struggle, of brilliant commanders and catastrophic failures, of temporary recoveries and accelerating decline, before the last Western emperor signed his abdication paper in Ravenna. But Adrianople was the moment when something essential broke, something that could not be repaired. For 6 centuries, since the legions of the Roman Republic had begun their conquest of the Mediterranean world, the Roman army had operated on a foundation of belief. The belief, held by Romans, by their allies, and crucially by their enemies, that a Roman army in the field, properly led and properly supplied, was simply better than anything it faced. Not always larger, not always better equipped, but better organized, better disciplined, better trained, and operating within a tactical system that had been refined over centuries of continuous warfare into something approaching perfection. Adrianople shattered that belief. The Gothic cavalry, warriors without the centuries of institutional military tradition that Rome possessed, without the engineering expertise, without the administrative infrastructure, had destroyed 2/3 of a Roman imperial army in a single afternoon. The news spread across the empire with the speed that bad news always travels faster than good. On the Rhine frontier, Germanic chieftains who had been held back by Roman military reputation began to recalculate. In Constantinople, the new Eastern Emperor Theodosius looked at his depleted army and understood that he did not have enough Roman soldiers left to replace what had been lost at Adrianople. So he made a deal. In 382 AD, Theodosius signed a treaty with the Visigoths that was unlike any Rome had made before. The Goths were allowed to settle within Roman territory, in the Balkans, in what is now Bulgaria and northern Greece, as a largely autonomous unit. They did not become Roman citizens in the traditional sense. They were not dispersed and integrated into Roman society the way previous groups had been. They kept their own leaders, their own laws, their own language, their own military structure. In exchange, they agreed to provide soldiers for the Roman army when called upon. It solved the immediate military crisis, but it established a precedent with profound long-term consequences. The empire had admitted, in the most formal and official terms possible, that it could no longer assimilate the people who were entering its territory. It could no longer transform outsiders into Romans. It could only accommodate them as they were, as a separate people, living inside Roman borders but not truly part of Roman civilization. owing loyalty to their own leaders first and to the emperor second. There were now, effectively, two peoples living inside the Roman Empire, and they did not always want the same things. Chapter 4, Stilicho, Alaric, and the Sack of Rome. There is a particular kind of tragedy that unfolds not through the actions of villains, but through the collision of two people who might, under different circumstances, have been allies. The story of Stilicho and Alaric is exactly that kind of tragedy, and the catastrophe it produced sent shockwaves through the Roman world that people were still writing about 100 years later. Flavius Stilicho was, by any objective measure, the most capable military commander in the Western Roman Empire during the late 4th and early 5th centuries. He was also, by birth, half Roman and half Vandal. His father had been a Vandal cavalry officer who served in the Roman army. His mother a Roman woman. He had risen through the military ranks on the strength of genuine ability. Married the niece of Emperor Theodosius, and by the time Theodosius died in 395 AD, Stilicho was the effective regent of the Western Empire, governing in the name of the 11-year-old Emperor Honorius, a boy who would grow into one of the least impressive rulers in Roman history. A man whose primary recorded interest was raising chickens. Stilicho spent the next decade doing something extraordinary, holding the Western Empire together almost entirely through his own efforts. He fought off invasions from multiple directions simultaneously. He negotiated with dangerous enemies when he could not defeat them militarily. He stretched an inadequate army across thousands of kilometers of frontier and somehow kept the borders intact. He was, in the judgment of most historians who have studied the period, the last truly effective military leader the Western Empire produced. But Stilicho had an enemy far more dangerous than any Germanic tribe or Hunnic raider. He had the court of Honorius. The political culture of the late Western Empire had become deeply paranoid, factional, and self-destructive. Around the emperor in Ravenna, the capital had been moved there from Milan in 402 AD because Ravenna's surrounding marshes made it nearly impregnable. A telling commentary on just how insecure the imperial government had become clustered a group of advisors and courtiers whose primary occupation was not governing the empire but destroying each other. Stilicho's competence made him enemies. His Vandal blood made him suspect. His policy of negotiating with Gothic leaders rather than simply trying to annihilate them struck many at court as dangerously soft. Perhaps even treasonous. The man who eventually brought Stilicho down was named Olympius, a court official of no particular military or administrative distinction whose talent lay entirely in the art of political manipulation. In 408 AD, Olympius convinced the young Emperor Honorius that Stilicho was plotting to place his own son on the Eastern throne. The accusation was almost certainly false. It did not matter. Honorius, who had never shown any capacity for independent judgment, believed it, or perhaps he simply saw an opportunity to remove a man who had always made him feel inadequate by comparison. On August 22, 408 AD, Stilicho was arrested and executed. On the same day, acting on orders from Ravenna, Roman soldiers throughout Italy fell upon the families of the Germanic soldiers who had served under Stilicho, men who had fought loyally for the empire for years. Wives were killed, children were enslaved. The soldiers themselves, some 30,000 men, found themselves suddenly without a commander, without protection, and with every reason to conclude that the Roman government considered them enemies rather than allies. Most of them went to join Alaric. Alaric was the leader of the Visigoths, the same Gothic people who had crossed the Danube in 376 AD, who had fought at Adrianople, who had been settled in the Balkans under the Treaty of 382. He was a Gothic nobleman who had served in the Roman army under Theodosius, who had fought alongside Stilicho in several campaigns, who had repeatedly sought from the Roman government what he considered a fair reward for his service and his people's loyalty, a permanent homeland within the empire. A recognized military command, the kind of formal integration that would give the Visigoths a secure place in the Roman world. The Roman government had repeatedly promised and repeatedly failed to deliver. Alaric's relationship with Rome across the first decade of the 5th century was a cycle of negotiation. Broken promises, military pressure, and renewed negotiation that grew progressively more bitter on both sides. Alaric was not, at heart, a destroyer of civilization. He was a man trying to secure a future for his people within the framework of the Roman world, because despite everything, despite the betrayals and the broken promises, the Roman world was the only world he knew. Gothic aristocrats like Alaric had grown up speaking Latin alongside Gothic, had absorbed Roman culture alongside their own, had served in Roman armies and administered Roman territories. They wanted in, not out. But after the execution of Stilicho and the massacre of the Germanic soldiers' families, the last genuine advocate for a negotiated settlement was gone. The Roman government under Olympius and the shuffling succession of incompetent advisors who followed him was incapable of making a deal and sticking to it. Alaric marched on Rome. He besieged the city twice, in 408 and 409 AD, and both times accepted a ransom to withdraw rather than attempting to storm the walls. During the second siege, he actually appointed a rival emperor, a Roman senator named Priscus Attalus, in an attempt to create a legitimate political counterweight to Honorius. None of it worked. Honorius, safe behind the marshes of Ravenna, refused to negotiate seriously. Attalus proved useless. The Eastern Empire, under Honorius's nephew Theodosius II, sent just enough military support to keep Honorius in power without actually solving the crisis. In the summer of 410 AD, Alaric's patience ran out. On the night of August 24, 410 AD, the exact circumstances remain debated by historians, with some ancient sources claiming that slaves inside the city opened the Salarian Gate for the Goths. Alaric's army entered Rome. What followed was 3 days of sacking. It is important to understand what this meant and what it did not mean, because the event has been both exaggerated and underplayed by different writers across the centuries. The sack of Rome in 410 was not the wholesale destruction of the city. The great monuments, the Colosseum, the Forum, the temples, the bath houses, the aqueducts, were not demolished. The population was not massacred. Alaric, who was himself a Christian, reportedly gave specific orders that Christian churches were to be respected as places of sanctuary, and that anyone who took refuge inside them was not to be harmed. Contemporary accounts describe Gothic soldiers escorting Roman citizens carrying valuables to the Basilica of St. Peter for safekeeping, then standing guard outside to prevent other Goths from looting it. What the sack was, in terms of physical destruction, was significant but survivable. Gold, silver, silk, and other portable valuables were taken. Some buildings were burned, some people were killed, more were taken as slaves, and wealthy Romans were held for ransom. The economic damage was severe. The psychological damage was immeasurable. Rome had not been entered by a foreign enemy in 800 years. The last time an enemy had breached the city's defenses was in 390 BC, nearly 8 centuries earlier, when a Gallic tribe called the Senones had sacked the city during a period before Rome's rise to Mediterranean dominance. Since that distant catastrophe, through the darkest days of the wars against Hannibal, through the civil wars, through the crisis of the 3rd century, through every disaster the ancient world had inflicted upon the Roman state, the city itself had remained inviolate. Its walls had never been breached. Its streets had never seen a foreign army march through them in victory. The news of the sack spread across the Roman world with the speed of a religious shock. Saint Jerome, one of the leading Christian scholars of the era, was living in Bethlehem when he heard. He wrote that he was so overwhelmed he could not speak, that the words died in his throat. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. He wrote, in Carthage, in North Africa, the theologian Augustine of Hippo, the man we now know as Saint Augustine, was confronted by pagans who argued that Rome had fallen because it had abandoned its traditional gods in favor of Christianity. Augustine spent the next 13 years writing a response to that argument, a massive theological work called The City of God, which became one of the most influential books in the history of Western Christianity and which would not have existed without the sack of 410, giving Augustine the urgency to write it. Alaric himself did not survive to see what his actions had set in motion. He marched his army south through Italy, intending to cross to North Africa, the grain-producing heartland of the Western Empire, the loss of which would be truly catastrophic for Rome. But before he could organize the crossing, he fell ill. He died in southern Italy later in 410 AD, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. his followers, according to the historian Jordanes writing a century and a half later, buried him in the bed of the Bucento River near the town of Cosenza, diverting the river, burying Alaric with his treasure in the riverbed, then releasing the waters again to hide the grave forever. The slaves who did the work were killed afterward so that no one could reveal the location. The grave of Alaric has never been found. Leadership of the Visigoths passed to Alaric's brother-in-law Ataulf, who eventually led the Visigoths out of Italy and into southern Gaul and Spain, where they established a Gothic kingdom that would endure for the next 2 centuries. The crisis in Italy eased somewhat. Honorius continued to raise chickens in Ravenna. Rome was not immediately destroyed. But something had changed in a way that could not be unchanged. The sack of 410 demonstrated beyond any serious argument that the Western imperial government could not protect its own capital city. Honorius had sat in Ravenna while Rome burned, if burned is not too strong a word for what actually happened, and had done nothing effective to prevent it. The military force needed to expel Alaric did not exist, or if it existed, could not be organized and deployed by an administration that had just destroyed its own most capable general on the basis of a courtier's accusation. The provinces watched. The Germanic chieftains along the frontiers watched. The local Roman aristocrats in Gaul and Spain and Britain, who were increasingly being left to defend themselves with their own resources, watched. And what they saw was a central government that was expensive. The taxes still came due. The imperial bureaucracy still demanded its fees, but that was no longer providing the core service that justified its existence. It was no longer keeping people safe. In Britain, the Roman legions had already been largely withdrawn to deal with crises on the continent. The island's Roman population was left to fend for itself against raids from Scotland and Ireland, and would eventually invite Germanic settlers, the Angles and Saxons from what is now northern Germany and Denmark, to help with defense. A decision that would transform Britain so completely that the Latin-speaking Roman province would eventually become England, a country whose very name derives from the Angles. In Gaul, local aristocrats began building their own relationships with Germanic chieftains rather than waiting for imperial help that was not coming. In Spain, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the Pyrenees in 409 AD and began carving out territories that the Western imperial government lacked the military strength to recover. The Western Empire was not yet dead in 410. It would continue to exist, in diminishing form, for another 66 years. There would be moments of temporary recovery, most notably under the general Aetius in the 430s and 440s, who managed to stabilize Gaul and who would earn the title, the last of the Romans, for his efforts. There would even be one final, extraordinary military achievement: the defeat of Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in 451 AD. The engagement that stopped the Hunnic conquest of Western Europe. But the trajectory after 410 was clear to anyone willing to see it honestly. The Western Empire was losing territory it could not recover, spending money it did not have, relying on military commanders it could not trust, governed by emperors who were increasingly children or ciphers manipulated by factions at court. Each decade brought new losses, new compromises, new accommodations with Germanic leaders that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The machine was running down, and the men responsible for maintaining it were too busy fighting each other to notice, or perhaps they noticed and simply could not stop it. Chapter 5, Attila, the Scourge of God. In the spring of Attila 434 AD, 2 brothers inherited leadership of the Hunnic Confederation from their uncle Rugila, who had died, possibly struck by lightning, according to one Roman source, which says something about how desperate Romans were to find divine intervention in the story of their tormentors. The brothers were named Bleda and Attila. Bleda was the older brother. He ruled jointly with Attila for 11 years. Then, in 445 AD, Bleda died. The circumstances were never officially explained. Roman historians writing close to the events strongly implied that Attila murdered him. Whether that is true or simply what Romans wanted to believe about a man they had already decided was a monster, the result was the same. From 445 AD onward, Attila ruled the Hunnic Empire alone. And alone, he became the single most terrifying figure in the entire story of Rome's decline, a man whose name 17 centuries later, remains synonymous with destruction. To understand Attila properly, you need to first understand what the Hunnic Empire actually was by the middle of the 5th century. Because it was something significantly more sophisticated than the image of wild horsemen charging out of the steppe that tends to dominate popular imagination. By the 440s, the Huns had been in contact with the Roman world for nearly 70 years. In that time, they had absorbed an enormous amount. Their court, centered in the Great Plains of what is now Hungary, had become a cosmopolitan place where Latin was spoken alongside Hunnic and Gothic. Where Roman diplomats came bearing gifts and tribute. Where merchants from across the known world traded goods. And where Attila himself received foreign ambassadors in a wooden palace complex that one Roman envoy, a man named Priscus of Panium, described in remarkable detail. Priscus visited Attila's court in 448 AD as part of a Roman diplomatic mission. And his account, substantial fragments of which have survived, is our single best source for what Attila was actually like as a person rather than as a legend. What Priscus described was not a savage. He described a ruler of considerable political intelligence. A man who understood Roman politics in detail. Who played the eastern and western courts against each other with great skill. Who knew exactly how much pressure to apply and when to ease off. And who had assembled around himself a court of advisors and subordinate rulers representing dozens of different peoples: Huns, Goths, Gepids, Burgundians, Alans, Syrians, and many others, held together by a combination of military dominance, personal loyalty, and the reliable distribution of plunder. Priscus also described a man of studied personal austerity. At a feast where Attila's Roman and Gothic guests ate from silver platters and drank from golden cups, Attila himself ate plain meat from a wooden plate and drank from a wooden cup. He wore plain clothing without ornamentation. This was not poverty, it was political theater. A deliberate projection of a certain kind of leadership. A statement that Attila was above the luxury that his subordinates enjoyed at his sufferance. It was, in its way, not entirely unlike the calculated austerity that certain Roman emperors had employed centuries earlier to project an image of republican virtue. The Hunnic Empire at its height stretched from the Rhine River in the west to somewhere beyond the Caspian Sea in the east, a territory larger than the Roman Empire itself. Its military power rested on the extraordinary Hunnic cavalry, but by the 440s that cavalry had been supplemented by infantry drawn from the subject Germanic peoples. Siege equipment operated by Roman engineers who had entered Hunnic service, and a logistical system capable of moving enormous armies across vast distances with a speed that consistently surprised Roman commanders. Attila used this power with ruthless efficiency. Between 441 and 443 AD, he launched the first of his great campaigns against the Eastern Roman Empire. Striking south across the Danube into the Balkans, the results were catastrophic for the East. The Hunnic army destroyed or captured more than 70 Roman cities and military installations across the Balkans, including Naissus, the birthplace of Emperor Constantine, which Priscus described years later as still so filled with the bones of the unburied dead that it was nearly uninhabitable. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II, a scholarly man better suited to compiling legal codes, his great achievement. The Codex Theodosianus was a comprehensive collection of Roman law that remains a foundational document of legal history, than to commanding armies. Sued for peace on humiliating terms, he agreed to pay Attila an annual tribute of 700 pounds of gold, later raised to 2.100 pounds per year, and to hand over all Hunnic refugees who had fled to Roman territory. For context, 2.100 pounds of gold per year represented an enormous portion of the Eastern Empire's annual revenue. The Eastern government met this demand partly by raising taxes and partly by stripping gold from the statues and public monuments of Constantinople, a visible public humiliation that every citizen of the capital could see happening with their own eyes. When Theodosius II died in 450 AD after falling from his horse, his successor Marcian immediately stopped paying the tribute. Attila's response to this defiance was characteristically indirect, rather than turning immediately against the East, which had a new and apparently more vigorous government. He turned west. His justification was, by any standard, extraordinary. Honoria was the sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, a woman of obvious intelligence and equally obvious frustration at the restricted life imposed on imperial women of her era. In 449 AD, she had sent a secret message to Attila, enclosing her personal ring, and asked him to intervene in her situation. Whether she was proposing marriage, seeking a political alliance, or simply making a desperate bid for freedom from an intolerable situation is debated by historians. What is clear is that Attila chose to interpret the ring as a formal betrothal. He sent ambassadors to Valentinian III demanding Honoria as his bride and half the Western Empire as her dowry. Valentinian was outraged. Honoria was hastily married off to a safe, politically insignificant Roman nobleman and placed under close supervision. The demand was rejected. Attila began to march. In the spring of 451 AD, an army whose size ancient sources estimated wildly, numbers ranging from 300,000 to 700,000, almost certainly exaggerations, with modern historians suggesting a more realistic figure of perhaps 100,000 to 200,000 warriors, crossed the Rhine into Gaul. The cities in the path of the advance were devastated. Metz fell, Reims fell, Tongeren fell, Troyes was threatened. The Hunnic army moved with the terrifying efficiency that had become its hallmark, stripping the land as it advanced, destroying what it could not carry. The response from the Western Empire was organized by the one man who might reasonably be called the last capable Roman general of the West, Flavius Aetius. A figure of remarkable personal history. Aetius had spent time as a young man as a hostage among both the Visigoths and the Huns, acquiring an intimate knowledge of both peoples that he had spent his career exploiting. He had risen to become the dominant military figure of the Western Empire in the 430s, earning the informal title, the last of the Romans, for his ability to keep the collapsing Western military structure functional. Now Aetius performed what many historians consider his greatest achievement. He assembled a coalition army, Romans, Visigoths, Burgundians, Alans, Franks, and Saxons, representing peoples who had been fighting each other, raiding each other, and occasionally massacring each other for decades. He convinced them, or compelled them, or bribed them, to fight together against a common enemy. It was an act of diplomatic and military improvisation that had no precedent in the late Roman world. The two armies met in June 451 AD at a location that ancient sources call the Catalaunian Plains or the Campus Mauriacus, somewhere in the Champagne region of northeastern France. Though the exact site has never been definitively identified, the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, also called the Battle of Chalon, was by ancient accounts one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the ancient world. Jordanes, writing a century later, claimed that 165,000 men died on the field, a number almost certainly inflated, but suggestive of the scale of the engagement. The battle was brutal and confused, as large ancient battles almost always were. The Hunnic right wing drove back the Roman left. The Visigothic king Theodoric I was killed in the fighting, trampled by his own cavalry, according to one account, but the Visigothic forces on the Roman right wing drove deep into the Hunnic left, and Attila himself was forced back to his camp, where his warriors formed a defensive perimeter of wagons. The Romans and their allies surrounded the camp but did not press the assault that night. The next morning, Attila was still inside his wagon fortress, making no move to resume the battle. And Aetius, in a decision that puzzled contemporaries and has puzzled historians ever since, made no serious effort to force a final engagement. The Visigothic nobles, grieving for their dead king and concerned about the political succession back in their kingdom, were eager to leave. Aetius let them go, and then, with his coalition dissolving around him, he allowed Attila to withdraw from the field and march his army back across the Rhine into Hunnic territory. Why? The most plausible explanation, and the one most historians now favor, is that Aetius understood something deeply uncomfortable. He needed Attila. A destroyed Hunnic empire meant the Germanic peoples who had been held in check by Hunnic dominance, the Ostrogoths, the Gepids, the Lombards, would be free to press against Roman territory with no counterweight. Attila alive and somewhat checked was, from Aetius's perspective, more useful than Attila dead. The Roman general was playing a long game of balance of power politics in a world where he no longer had the military strength to simply destroy his enemies. It was sophisticated thinking. It was also a calculation that assumed Aetius himself would remain in the picture. Attila returned to Gaul the following year, 452 AD, swinging south into Italy this time. The wealthy cities of the Po Valley in northern Italy, Aquileia, Padua, Verona, Brescia, Bergamo, Milan, fell in rapid succession. Aquileia, one of the great cities of the late Roman world, was so completely destroyed that it never recovered. Refugees from the city and surrounding region fled to a cluster of islands in a nearby lagoon, where they built new settlements on the water that the Hunnic cavalry could not easily reach. Those settlements would eventually grow into the city of Venice. Attila marched south toward Rome itself. And then something strange happened. A delegation met him on the banks of the Mincio River. Leading the delegation was Leo I, the Bishop of Rome, the man we now call Pope Leo the Great. What was said at that meeting was not recorded by any eyewitness. The only accounts come from sources written decades or centuries later. The most dramatic versions claim that when Leo rode out to meet Attila, the Hunnic king saw standing behind the elderly bishop the figures of the apostles Peter and Paul, armed and threatening, and was so frightened that he agreed to withdraw. More prosaic explanations cite the practical reality that Attila's army was suffering from disease. That supply lines stretching back across the Alps were becoming untenable, and that a strong Eastern Roman army under the general Marcian had crossed the Danube and was raiding Hunnic territory in Attila's absence. Attila withdrew from Italy without sacking Rome. He returned to his palace on the Hungarian plain, began planning new campaigns, and took a new wife, a young woman named Ildico, on the morning after the wedding feast. In the spring of 453 AD, Attila did not emerge from his chamber. When his attendants finally broke down the door, they found him dead in his bed. Beside him, weeping and terrified, sat Ildico. The cause of death, according to Priscus, was a nosebleed. He had drunk heavily at the feast, fallen into a deep sleep, and choked on blood from a hemorrhage that the wine had either caused or worsened. The most feared man in the Western world died not in battle, not from an assassin's blade, but from a nosebleed on his wedding night. What followed was as sudden and complete as anything in the history of great powers. Attila's sons, he had many, by many wives, immediately began fighting each other over the inheritance. The subject peoples who had been held together by Attila's personal authority and military dominance saw their opportunity. The Gepids, a Germanic people who had long chafed under Hunnic control, rose in rebellion and defeated Attila's sons at the Battle of Nedao in 454 AD. The Hunnic Empire, which had terrorized half the known world for decades, fragmented with a speed that left contemporaries almost as stunned as its rise had. Within a generation, the Huns had effectively ceased to exist as a political entity. The people who remained merged with other steppe populations and disappeared from the historical record. The empire Attila had built, held together by his personal genius and force of will rather than by any durable institutional structure, simply evaporated. For Rome, it was too late for the Hunnic collapse to matter. Because in the same year that Attila died, the man who had organized the West's greatest military achievement against him was murdered by the emperor he served. Valentinian III killed Aetius with his own hands in September 454 AD, stabbing him during an audience in Ravenna, reportedly with the encouragement of courtiers who feared Aetius's power and influence. A Roman observer at the time reportedly told Valentinian that he had cut off his right hand with his left. 6 months later, 2 of Aetius's former bodyguards assassinated Valentinian in revenge. The last genuinely capable general of the Western Empire and the last member of the Theodosian dynasty died within 6 months of each other, leaving the Western imperial throne to a rapid succession of emperors controlled by the Germanic military commanders who now constituted the only real military force left in the West. The Western Empire had 22 years left. Chapter 6, The Last 20 Years. After the deaths of Aetius and Valentinian III, the Western Roman Empire did not so much collapse as dissolve, slowly, unevenly, like a tablet of salt left in shallow water, losing its edges first, then its center, until one day you reached into the water and found nothing there at all. The 9 emperors who ruled the West between 455 and 476 AD are among the most obscure figures in Roman history. Not because their reigns were uneventful, but because events had moved so far beyond the control of any individual emperor that the men who held the title had become almost irrelevant to the actual functioning of what remained of the Western state. Power had migrated away from the imperial throne and into the hands of the Germanic military commanders, men called magistri militum, masters of soldiers, who commanded the only effective armed forces left in the West and who made and unmade emperors with the casual efficiency of men who had long since stopped pretending that the institution they served had any real authority. The year 455 AD opened with an event that demonstrated this reality with brutal clarity. 2 months after Valentinian III was assassinated, a Vandal fleet sailed from Carthage in North Africa and appeared in the harbor of Rome. Its commander was Gaiseric, the king of the Vandals, a Germanic people who had crossed from Spain into North Africa in 429 AD and spent the following decades building a maritime kingdom that controlled the western Mediterranean's most productive grain-growing region and could threaten the coastlines of Italy, Gaul, and Spain at will. Gaiseric had a grievance. Before his assassination, Valentinian III had promised his daughter Eudocia in marriage to Gaiseric's son Huneric. The new emperor, a man named Petronius Maximus who had effectively bought the throne through bribery and political maneuvering, cancelled the arrangement and married Eudocia to his own son instead. Gaiseric considered this a breach of contract. His response was to sail to Rome and collect what he considered his due. Pope Leo I, the same man who had met Attila on the banks of the Mincio 3 years earlier, rode out again to meet an invader approaching Rome. This time his negotiating position was significantly weaker. He could not point to a plague decimating the enemy army or an Eastern Roman counterattack threatening their homeland. All he could extract from Gaiseric was a promise not to kill the inhabitants or burn the buildings. Gaiseric kept his word on both counts. He then spent 14 days systematically stripping Rome of everything portable and valuable. The Vandals took gold, silver, bronze, silk, ivory, artwork, and people. Among the treasures they loaded onto their ships were the menorah and other sacred objects that the Emperor Titus had taken from the temple in Jerusalem when the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD. Objects that had been displayed in Rome for nearly 4 centuries as symbols of Roman power. They also took people, including Valentinian's widow Eudoxia and her 2 daughters, one of whom, Eudocia, was duly married to Gaiseric's son Huneric as originally planned. The Vandals sailed back to Carthage, their ships riding low in the water under the weight of Roman treasure. The word vandalism entered the vocabulary of history. What remained of the Western Empire after 455 AD was a shadow of the thing Augustus had built 4.5 centuries earlier. The actual territory under direct imperial control had shrunk dramatically. Britain had been effectively independent since around 410 AD. Its Roman population left to its own devices as the legions were withdrawn and never replaced. Large parts of Gaul were now controlled by Gothic, Burgundian, and Frankish kingdoms, Germanic rulers who nominally acknowledged Roman suzerainty but in practice governed their territories without reference to Ravenna. Spain was largely in Visigothic hands. North Africa belonged to the Vandals. What the Western Emperor actually controlled, in any meaningful sense, was Italy, and even there, his authority depended entirely on the goodwill of whatever Germanic military commander happened to be running the army at any given moment. The tax base had collapsed along with the territory. This is a point that deserves emphasis because it is easy to think of the Western Empire's decline purely in military terms. Barbarians at the gates, battles lost, cities sacked, but the fiscal dimension was equally important and ultimately just as decisive. The Roman state ran on tax revenue. Taxes paid the soldiers, maintained the roads and aqueducts, funded the grain distributions that kept city populations fed, and sustained the enormous bureaucratic apparatus that administered the empire. As territory was lost to Germanic kingdoms, the tax revenue from those territories stopped flowing to Ravenna. As the economy contracted in the remaining territories, the tax base there shrank too. As large landowners, the senatorial aristocracy who owned the great estates of Italy and Gaul, increasingly negotiated their own arrangements with Germanic rulers rather than paying taxes to an imperial government that could no longer protect them. The revenue base eroded further. The response, predictable and self-defeating, was to raise taxes on those who remained within reach. Small farmers and tradespeople in Italy found themselves paying higher and higher levies to fund an imperial government that was delivering less and less in return. Many simply abandoned their lands and attached themselves to large aristocratic estates as dependents, coloni. Tenant farmers who gave up legal freedom in exchange for the protection of a powerful landlord who could shield them from imperial tax collectors. This process, called the colonatus, had been developing since the 3rd century, but it accelerated dramatically in the 5th. It was, in embryonic form, the feudal system that would organize European society for the next 1,000 years. A system born directly from the failure of the Roman state to maintain the conditions under which free smallholders could survive. The series of emperors during these final decades reads like a catalogue of inadequacy. Libius Severus, who ruled from 461 to 465 AD, was so completely controlled by the Germanic general Ricimer, the man who had become the real power behind the Western throne after the death of Aetius, that contemporary sources sometimes forget to mention Severus at all. Writing about events in terms of what Ricimer did without noting that there was technically an emperor. Ricimer was himself a man of mixed Gothic and Visigothic ancestry, a grandson of the Visigothic king Wallia, who had reached the highest military command in the Roman army but could not take the imperial title himself because his barbarian blood made it constitutionally impossible. So he made and unmade emperors instead, serving as the power behind a series of increasingly nominal rulers. The one emperor of these final years who showed any genuine capacity was Anthemius, who ruled from 467 to 472 AD and was actually appointed by the Eastern Emperor Leo I in a last attempt to shore up the Western government with a competent ruler. Anthemius launched an ambitious campaign against the Vandals in North Africa, a joint Eastern-Western operation involving a fleet of over 1,000 ships and an army of around 100,000 men. Funded largely by the Eastern Treasury, the campaign was one of the greatest military disasters in late Roman history. The Eastern fleet was destroyed by Vandal fireships in the harbor of Cape Bon in 468 AD, eliminating at a stroke both the Eastern Empire's naval power and much of its financial reserves. The land army, stranded without naval support, disintegrated, Gaiseric remained in control of North Africa. Ricimer, who had never liked Anthemius and had been in open conflict with him for years, used the humiliation of the African disaster as justification to move against the emperor directly. In 472 AD, Ricimer besieged Rome, a Roman general besieging Rome, and after 3 months of street fighting that caused significant damage to the city, captured and killed Anthemius. Ricimer died of illness 6 weeks later, having outlived his usefulness in every possible sense. The brief civil war had further depleted the military forces and financial resources of the already crippled Western Empire. What followed was purely mechanical. The process of imperial succession had become entirely detached from any institutional logic. Emperors were appointed by Germanic commanders or by the Eastern court, reigned for months or a year or two, and were removed when they became inconvenient. Glycerus ruled for a year. Julius Nepos ruled for slightly longer and then fled to Dalmatia when the Germanic military commander Orestes, a Roman who had spent years at Attila's court as a secretary and returned to Italy after the Hunnic Empire's collapse, raised his own troops and marched on Ravenna. Orestes did not take the imperial title for himself. Instead, on October 31, 475 AD, he placed his own son on the throne. His son's name was Romulus. In a touch of irony so heavy it seems almost invented, the boy emperor was given the nickname Augustulus, Little Augustus, because he was so young and the title so obviously too large for him. He was probably around 14 or 15 years old. He had no political experience, no military training, no particular qualities that anyone recorded as remarkable. He was, simply, his father's son, placed on the throne because his father needed a figurehead and a Roman name to give his own power a veneer of legitimacy. The army that Orestes commanded and that had put Romulus Augustulus on the throne was composed largely of Germanic soldiers, Heruli, Syrians, Rugians, and others, who had been serving in what remained of the Roman military structure for years. These men were not outsiders to the Roman system. They were, in many ways, its last functioning component. They spoke Latin. They used Roman military equipment. They observed Roman military customs. But they had a grievance that had been building for years. They wanted land. This was not an unreasonable request. The Roman practice of settling retired soldiers on agricultural land had been a cornerstone of the military system for centuries. A soldier served his term, received his land, became a farmer, and his sons sometimes enlisted in the next generation. But in the 5th century, as Roman territory shrank and the large aristocratic estates consolidated their hold over the Italian countryside, there was no land available to distribute. The Germanic soldiers in the Roman army knew this. They had watched Roman aristocrats maintain their vast estates while the soldiers who defended those estates had nothing to show for their service. In 476 AD, they sent a delegation to Orestes with a formal demand. They wanted 1/3 of the land in Italy. It was the same arrangement that the Visigoths had received in southern Gaul, that the Burgundians had received in eastern Gaul, that the Vandals had in North Africa. Every Germanic group that had settled in the Western Empire had received land allocations from the territories where they settled. The soldiers in Italy wanted the same. Orestes refused. His reasoning was probably straightforward. Granting 1/3 of Italian land to the Germanic soldiers meant dispossessing 1/3 of the Italian landowners, the senatorial aristocracy, the backbone of what remained of Roman civilian society. The people whose tax payments and political cooperation kept the imperial government nominally functioning. It was politically impossible, or at least Orestes believed it was. The Germanic soldiers found a new leader. His name was Odoacer. He was the commander of the Heruli contingent, a man of imposing physical presence and considerable political intelligence who had been watching the dysfunction of the Western imperial government for years. When Orestes refused the land demand, Odoacer stepped forward and made the soldiers a simple promise. Give him their loyalty, and he would get them their land. They gave him their loyalty. Orestes was defeated in battle and captured near the city of Piacenza in late August 476 AD. He was executed on August 28. His brother Paulus was killed in fighting near Ravenna a few days later. Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor who had been placed on the throne by his father and who had no military force and no political base of his own, was now entirely alone. Odoacer rode into Ravenna. The meeting between Odoacer and Romulus Augustulus in September 476 AD lasted, in all probability, a very short time. There was nothing to negotiate. Romulus had nothing to offer and nothing to threaten. Odoacer had everything: the army, the city, the practical control of what remained of the Western imperial government. The only question was what to do with the boy. Odoacer was, by the standards of his time and his position, surprisingly merciful. He could have killed Romulus. The execution of a deposed emperor was far more common in Roman history than the alternative. Instead, he exiled him to the Castellum Lucullanum on the Bay of Naples and granted him an annual pension of 6,000 gold pieces. Some historians have speculated that Odoacer was moved by the boy's youth. Others suggest that executing a 14-year-old who had never actually wielded any real power would have served no political purpose and might have created unnecessary resentment. The most likely explanation is simpler. Romulus Augustulus was irrelevant. He posed no threat. He had no followers, no resources, no claim that anyone was likely to press on his behalf. Killing him would have been pointless. And Odoacer, whatever else he was not a man who did pointless things. Odoacer then sent the imperial regalia, the purple robes, the diadem, the other symbols of Western imperial authority, to Constantinople. To the Eastern Emperor Zeno, he sent a message explaining that there was no longer any need for a separate Western emperor. The Roman world, he suggested, needed only one emperor, and that emperor sat in Constantinople. Odoacer himself would govern Italy as a representative of the Eastern court, using the title Rex, king, rather than any Roman imperial title. Zeno was not entirely pleased. He had his own preferred candidate for the Western throne, Julius Nepos, the former emperor who had been living in exile in Dalmatia since 475 and who technically had never formally abdicated. Zeno told Odoacer he should acknowledge Julius Nepos as the legitimate Western emperor. Odoacer nodded, issued a few coins with Julius Nepos's name on them, and otherwise continued governing Italy exactly as he had before. Julius Nepos died in Dalmatia in 480 AD, murdered by his own servants, and the matter became moot. The Western Roman Empire was over. The remarkable thing, the thing that makes this ending so different from what the drama of the preceding centuries might have led you to expect, is how little immediate difference it made to most people living in Italy. The sun rose the morning after Romulus Augustulus signed the abdication papers. Farmers in the Po Valley went out to tend their fields. Merchants in the port of Ostia unloaded cargo from ships arriving from the eastern Mediterranean. Senators in Rome attended to their estates and their legal affairs. The roads were still there. The aqueducts were still running, some of them, at least. The Latin language was still spoken everywhere. The Christian church still held services in its basilicas. The law courts still operated, using the same legal codes they had used for centuries. Life continued, just without an emperor. Odoacer governed Italy for the next 17 years with considerable competence. He maintained the Roman administrative system essentially intact, kept Roman law in force, and employed Roman bureaucrats to run the machinery of government. He respected the Senate and the Church. He repaired infrastructure, by most measures that ordinary Italians would have recognized. His rule was better than what the last several decades of imperial government had provided. This is perhaps the most important single fact about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It was not experienced by most of the people who lived through it as a catastrophe. There was no single day of darkness, no moment when everyone understood that civilization had ended. What there was, instead, was a very long, very gradual process of change, political, economic, social, cultural, that unfolded over centuries and that looked different depending on where you stood and when you were looking. The catastrophe was real, but it was a catastrophe measured in generations, not in days. 9/11. Chapter 7, What was lost, what survived, and why it took centuries to understand either. In the summer of 537 AD, 61 years after Romulus Augustulus signed his abdication in Ravenna, a Byzantine general named Belisarius rode into Rome at the head of an Eastern Roman army. The citizens who came out to watch him enter through the Asinarian gate were, by contemporary accounts, visibly starving. Some were too weak to stand for long. The streets that had once been packed with over 1 million people were quiet in the way that abandoned places are quiet, not peaceful, but empty. The population of the city of Rome at that moment had fallen to somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 people. At the height of the empire, Rome had held more than 1 million inhabitants. That means within roughly 4 centuries, the time between the reign of Augustus and the Gothic Wars of the 6th century, the city had lost more than 95% of its population. Not through a single massacre or a single plague, but through the slow, grinding process of a system coming apart. People left because there was no work. They left because the grain shipments from North Africa had stopped. They left because the aqueducts that had brought clean water from the mountains were falling into disrepair and no one had the money or the organizational capacity to fix them. They left because a city of 1 million people requires an enormous, sophisticated supply chain to function. And that supply chain had dissolved along with the empire that built it. That single number, a city shrinking from 1 million to 30,000, is the most honest summary of what the fall of Rome actually meant in human terms. But to understand it properly, you need to understand what exactly was lost, what managed to survive, and why the full consequences of the collapse took not decades but centuries to work themselves out across the former territories of the Western Empire. The first and most immediate loss was physical infrastructure. The Roman Empire had been, at its core, an infrastructure civilization. Its genius was not primarily military or artistic or philosophical, though it excelled at all three. Its deepest genius was organizational. The ability to build and maintain complex physical systems across enormous distances and keep them functioning reliably over long periods of time. Roads, aqueducts, sewers, ports, bridges, granaries, the physical skeleton of a sophisticated urban civilization. These systems did not collapse the moment the last emperor abdicated. They degraded gradually, over decades and generations, as the organizational and financial capacity needed to maintain them disappeared. An aqueduct is an extraordinary feat of engineering, but it requires constant maintenance, clearing sediment from channels, repairing cracks in the stonework, replacing lead pipes that corrode over time, managing the water distribution system that connects the main channel to individual neighborhoods and buildings. All of that requires money, skilled workers, and most importantly an administrative authority capable of coordinating the work across the length of the structure, which might run for dozens of kilometers through difficult terrain. When the Western imperial government collapsed, that administrative authority fragmented. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced it were not, in most cases, hostile to Roman infrastructure. Odoacer in Italy, Theodoric the Ostrogoth who followed him, the Visigoths in Spain, even to some extent the Franks in Gaul all made efforts to maintain what they inherited. But maintaining a Roman aqueduct required Roman engineering knowledge, Roman administrative systems, and Roman financial resources. All three were in short supply. Gradually, one by one, the aqueducts fell silent. The water stopped flowing. Cities that had depended on that water either found alternative sources, rivers, wells, rainwater, or shrank to the size that those alternatives could support. Rome's great aqueduct system, which at its peak delivered over 1 million cubic meters of fresh water to the city every day, was largely destroyed during the Gothic Wars of the 6th century, when besieging armies cut the channels to deprive the defenders of water. Some sections were repaired, most were not. The baths that had been the social heart of Roman urban life, places where tens of thousands of people gathered daily not just to wash but to meet, to do business, to gossip, to exercise, to read in the libraries that many bath complexes included, went cold and silent. Without the aqueducts, there was not enough water to run them. The road system lasted longer, because roads require less active maintenance than water systems. A well-built Roman road, laid on a proper foundation with good drainage, can remain usable for centuries without significant repair. Many Roman roads in Britain, France, Italy, and Spain remained in active use throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern period. Some are still visible today. Their stone surfaces worn smooth by 2,000 years of feet, hooves, and wheels, but without the imperial maintenance system that had kept them in good repair. The roads gradually deteriorated, bridges washed out and were not rebuilt. Sections became impassable in winter. The seamless, empire-wide transportation network that had allowed goods, people, and information to move with remarkable speed across the Western world fragmented into a patchwork of local routes. Some good, many poor, none coordinated. The economic consequences of infrastructure decay were profound and compounding. The Roman economy at its height had been genuinely sophisticated by ancient standards, not modern. Not industrial, but a real market economy with long-distance trade, specialized production, professional merchants, banking services, insurance, and a reliable currency that allowed complex transactions across vast distances. A pottery manufacturer in Gaul could sell his products in Britain, in Spain, in North Africa. A farmer in Egypt could count on a market for his grain in Rome. A merchant in Syria could finance a trading expedition to India using letters of credit honored in Alexandria and Antioch. All of this depended on the infrastructure that made long-distance trade possible and the political stability that made contracts enforceable. When both degraded simultaneously, the long-distance trade networks contracted. Not overnight, the contraction took generations, but consistently and substantially. Archaeologists can trace this process with remarkable precision through the distribution of pottery. In the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, mass-produced Roman pottery, distinctive red gloss ware called terra sigillata, manufactured in large industrial workshops in Gaul and exported across the entire empire, appears in excavations from Scotland to the Sahara. From Portugal to the Black Sea, it was the mass-produced consumer good of its era. cheap enough for ordinary households to own and uniform enough to be instantly recognizable. By the 6th and 7th centuries, that continent-wide distribution had vanished. People were using locally made pottery, cruder, more varied, less standardized, because the trade networks that had distributed the good stuff no longer functioned reliably. The same pattern appears in the evidence for building construction. The large, sophisticated stone buildings of the Roman period, the bathhouses, the basilicas, the apartment blocks, the warehouses, required not just money but specialized knowledge and organized labor. Architects who understood how to design a concrete vault, engineers who could calculate the stresses on a stone arch, workers skilled in laying foundations that would not shift and settle. That knowledge existed within the Roman system as a living tradition, passed from experienced practitioners to apprentices within large construction organizations that had continuous work to do. When the work stopped, when there was no longer an imperial government commissioning large building projects, when cities were shrinking rather than growing, the tradition broke. Knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate was lost within a generation or two simply because there was no one to pass it on to and no reason to learn it. The result is visible in the archaeological record with stark clarity. Building construction in the former Western Empire in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries shrank dramatically in both scale and sophistication. Large public buildings were no longer constructed. Existing buildings were repurposed, subdivided, or stripped for materials. The marble cladding of Roman monuments ended up as building material for medieval churches. The lead pipes of Roman water systems were melted down for other uses. The stone of Roman walls was quarried for new construction. The physical fabric of Roman civilization was gradually consumed by the societies that inherited it. Because those societies lacked both the resources to build new large structures and the knowledge to maintain the old ones indefinitely. This process had a name that medieval people themselves did not use but that historians have since applied to it. They called it the Dark Ages. The term is controversial among historians today. And rightly so, because it carries implications of total cultural and intellectual stagnation that do not accurately reflect what actually happened in the former Roman territories between the 5th and 10th centuries. Life continued. People farmed, traded, worshipped, raised children, told stories, made art, developed laws. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced Roman administration in the West were not simply destroyers, they preserved much of what they found, adapted it, and built upon it in their own ways. The Catholic Church, which survived the political collapse of the Western Empire largely intact, became the primary custodian of Latin literacy and Roman legal traditions, maintaining schools, copying manuscripts, and providing the administrative continuity that secular government could no longer supply. What the term Dark Ages does accurately capture is something real and important: the loss of complexity. The Roman world at its height was complex in the way that modern societies are complex, specialized, interdependent, capable of organizing large numbers of people toward shared goals across large distances. That complexity produced extraordinary things. It also made the system vulnerable in ways that simpler systems are not. A subsistence farmer in early medieval Europe was poor by Roman standards. But he was also resilient. If the harvest failed, he suffered. But he did not depend on a supply chain stretching across 3 continents to feed himself. The Roman city dweller who depended on grain from Egypt and pottery from Gaul and water from a mountain aqueduct was wealthier and more comfortable, but far more vulnerable to disruptions in any of those supply chains. When the system that maintained those supply chains collapsed, the people who depended on them either adapted, moving to the countryside, reverting to local subsistence agriculture, attaching themselves to large estates, or died. Many died. The population of the former Western Roman Empire fell significantly between the 5th and 8th centuries. Estimates vary widely because the demographic evidence is fragmentary. But most historians believe the total population of Western Europe declined by somewhere between 20 and 40% during this period, with the losses concentrated in urban areas and among the populations most dependent on the long-distance trade and administrative systems of the empire. The disease environment made everything worse. The Roman Empire had been, among other things, an extraordinarily efficient disease transmission system. Its roads and trade networks connected populations across vast distances. allowing pathogens to spread with a speed and reach that would not be matched again until the age of sailing ships. The Antonine Plague of the 2nd century, which killed an estimated 5 million people across the empire, and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century, which at its peak was reportedly killing 5,000 people a day in Rome alone, had already weakened the demographic foundation of the empire before the political collapse of the 5th century. When the climate began to cool slightly in the late 5th and 6th centuries, a period climatologists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, agricultural yields fell. Malnutrition increased, and populations already stressed by political disruption became more vulnerable to disease. The Plague of Justinian, which struck the Byzantine Empire and the former western provinces beginning in 541 AD, was the first well-documented outbreak of bubonic plague in European history. It killed, by modern estimates, between 25 and 50 million people, perhaps half the population of Europe and the Mediterranean world. Its timing, arriving just as the Byzantine Empire under Justinian was making a serious attempt to reconquer the former western provinces, effectively ended any realistic possibility of restoring something resembling the Roman world. Justinian's wars in Italy, North Africa, and Spain had already devastated those regions. The plague finished the job. By 600 AD, the world that had existed under the Roman Empire was gone in the West in every meaningful sense. Not just politically, gone economically, demographically, physically. The cities had shrunk to towns or abandoned altogether. The roads were deteriorating. The Latin language, the universal medium of communication across the empire, was fracturing into the regional dialects that would eventually become French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. The single legal system that had governed millions of people from Britain to Mesopotamia had been replaced by a patchwork of local customs and Germanic law codes. The money economy that had sustained long-distance trade had given way in many areas to a barter economy or a gift economy organized around the personal relationships between lords and their dependents. And yet, among the ruins, certain things survived with remarkable tenacity. The Catholic Church preserved Latin literacy at a time when it might otherwise have disappeared entirely from the West. In monasteries from Ireland to northern Italy, monks copied manuscripts by hand, Roman histories, Roman legal texts, Roman scientific works, Roman poetry, not always because they understood or valued the content, but because copying manuscripts was a form of devotional practice, a discipline of the monastic life. Those copied manuscripts became the primary conduit through which the knowledge of the ancient world passed into the medieval period and eventually into the Renaissance. Roman law survived in a particularly interesting way. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced the Western Empire did not simply abolish Roman law. They maintained dual legal systems, one set of laws for the Germanic population, a separate set for the Roman population living under their rule. This arrangement, called the personality of law, recognized that people carried their legal traditions with them as a personal attribute rather than accepting the law of wherever they happened to be living. Over time, as Germanic and Roman populations intermarried and the distinction between them blurred, the two legal traditions merged. The result was the complex, hybrid legal culture of medieval Europe, deeply influenced by Roman precedents even when it did not explicitly acknowledge them. The Latin language itself survived, transformed. Classical Latin, the formal, literary language of Cicero and Virgil, gradually became a specialized learned language, used by the church and by educated elites, while the spoken dialects of ordinary people evolved into the Romance languages. But the Romance languages are Latin. French is Latin spoken by people whose pronunciation and vocabulary shifted over centuries of isolation from the standardizing influence of a central imperial culture. Spanish is Latin. Italian is Latin. The empire died, but its language kept talking, in new forms, in new mouths, carrying forward words and grammatical structures and ways of organizing thought that trace their ancestry back to the streets of ancient Rome. The physical monuments endured longer than almost anything else. The Colosseum still stands in Rome, nearly 2,000 years after its completion. The Pantheon, built under Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD, still has its original concrete dome intact, the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world until the 19th century. The aqueduct of Segovia in Spain still spans its valley on 2 tiers of granite arches, looking very much as it did when Roman engineers completed it in the 1st century AD. Hadrian's Wall still runs across the width of northern England. The ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved under volcanic ash since 79 AD, give us our most direct window into the texture of ordinary Roman life: the shop fronts, the painted walls, the bread still in the ovens. These physical survivals matter not just as tourist attractions but as ongoing evidence of what was achieved. Every generation since the fall of Rome that has encountered these structures has had to reckon with the fact that people built these things without modern technology. Without computers or cranes or reinforced concrete. Without the industrial supply chains that modern construction depends on. That reckoning has repeatedly inspired attempts to understand how they did it. To recover the lost techniques. To reconnect with the technical and organizational traditions that the collapse severed. The Renaissance, that extraordinary flowering of European intellectual and artistic life that began in Italy in the 14th century and transformed the Western world, was in large part an explicit attempt to recover what Rome had been. The humanist scholars of 15th century Florence were not simply admiring ruins. They were excavating, literally and intellectually, the civilization that had preceded them. Reading the surviving manuscripts, studying the surviving buildings, trying to reconstruct the knowledge and the values and the aesthetic standards of a world that had been lost for 1,000 years. They could not recover it exactly. Too much was gone. Too much had changed. The world they lived in was not and could not be Rome. But the attempt to recover it, and the partial successes of that attempt, produced some of the greatest art, architecture, literature, and scientific thinking in the history of human civilization. Which raises the final, uncomfortable question that the story of Rome's fall always eventually arrives at. If a civilization as powerful, as sophisticated, as apparently permanent as the Roman Empire could collapse, not through a sudden catastrophic defeat, but through the slow accumulation of institutional failures, fiscal crises, political dysfunction, and loss of social cohesion, what does that mean for the civilizations that came after it? What does it mean for ours? 9:13. Chapter 8, What Rome Teaches Us. There is a particular kind of discomfort that comes from studying the fall of Rome too carefully. It begins as an intellectual exercise, a fascinating story about emperors and barbarians, about battles and betrayals, about a civilization that built extraordinary things and then watched them crumble. But somewhere in the middle of that story, if you are paying attention, the discomfort shifts from intellectual to personal. Because the more closely you examine the specific mechanisms of Rome's decline, not the dramatic moments, not the sackings and the assassinations, but the slow, grinding, structural failures that made all those dramatic moments possible, the more familiar they begin to sound. Not because history repeats itself in any simple or mechanical way. It does not. The world of the 5th century AD was profoundly different from the world of the 21st. And anyone who draws direct one-to-one parallels between Roman senators and modern politicians, between Germanic tribes and modern geopolitical rivals, is doing history a disservice. The specific details do not map cleanly onto our present, but the underlying patterns, the ways that powerful, complex systems fail, those patterns are worth sitting with honestly. Because they are not unique to Rome. They appear, in different forms, in the history of every great civilization that has ever existed. The first thing Rome teaches us is about the relationship between complexity and fragility. The Roman Empire at its height was the most complex organizational system the ancient Western world had ever produced. That complexity was the source of its extraordinary power. It allowed Rome to coordinate the labor of millions of people across millions of square kilometers. To build infrastructure that no smaller or simpler society could have conceived. To sustain urban populations that could not have fed or supplied themselves without the vast logistical networks the empire maintained. The complexity was what made Rome great. But complexity has a cost that is easy to miss during the good years. A complex system is an interdependent system. And interdependence means that failures in one part of the system create cascading problems in other parts. When the tax revenue from Gaul began to decline because Germanic groups were establishing control over parts of the province, The army that defended the Danube frontier became harder to pay. When the army became harder to pay, it became harder to recruit high-quality soldiers. When the quality of frontier defense declined, more Germanic groups were able to cross into Roman territory, further reducing the tax base. Each failure made the next failure more likely. And the system that had been so powerful during the good years had no built-in mechanism for reversing the spiral once it began. The Roman government understood, at various points, that something was wrong. It was not ignorant of its own decline. Emperors and administrators throughout the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries wrote extensively about the problems they faced, the corruption in the bureaucracy, the difficulty of recruiting soldiers, the shrinking tax base, the declining quality of the coinage. They understood the symptoms. What they consistently failed to do was address the root causes. Because addressing root causes required making painful sacrifices that powerful groups within Roman society refused to accept. The senatorial aristocracy, for example, owned enormous amounts of land and paid relatively little tax on it. Throughout the late Empire, reformers periodically proposed taxing the great estates more heavily to fund the military. Those proposals were consistently blocked by the aristocrats who controlled the Senate and had the ear of the emperor. The short-term interests of the most powerful group in Roman society consistently overrode the long-term interests of the empire as a whole. The men who had the most to lose from Rome's collapse were, paradoxically, among the most consistent obstacles to the reforms that might have prevented it. This is the second thing Rome teaches us, that the greatest threats to complex systems often come not from outside enemies but from inside. From the powerful groups whose short-term interests diverge from the long-term health of the system they depend on. The Germanic tribes on the frontier were a real external pressure. The Sassanid Persians were a genuine military threat. The Huns were a force of extraordinary destructive power. But none of these external pressures were inherently fatal. Rome had faced comparable or greater external threats in earlier centuries and survived them. What made the external threats of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries fatal was the internal weaknesses they exposed and exploited, the political instability, the fiscal exhaustion, the loss of institutional capacity, the inability to sustain the social consensus that makes collective sacrifice possible. An empire whose elites are unwilling to pay taxes to defend it. Whose political system produces a new emperor every 2 years through assassination and civil war. Whose currency has been debased to the point where merchants refuse to accept it at face value. Whose army is so underpaid and under-equipped that it relies on the very people it is supposed to be defending against. That empire does not need a Hannibal or an Attila to destroy it. It is destroying itself. The external enemies are almost incidental. They are simply the force that finally pushes over a structure that has already been fatally undermined from within. The third lesson is about institutional memory and the knowledge embedded in functioning systems. One of the most striking things about Rome's collapse is how much knowledge disappeared with it. Not because books were burned, though books were burned, but because knowledge that exists only as a living practice, transmitted from experienced practitioners to apprentices within functioning institutions, dies when those institutions stop functioning. The Roman engineers who knew how to build a concrete dome like the Pantheon were not keeping their knowledge secret. They were not hiding it in coded manuscripts. They were doing it, continuously, within a tradition of practice that kept the knowledge alive by using it. When the demand for large construction projects disappeared along with the imperial funding that had sustained them, that tradition of practice ended. The knowledge did not survive in any form that later generations could access. The same was true of administrative knowledge, the practical expertise of running a complex fiscal system, maintaining a professional army, managing long-distance supply chains, conducting effective diplomacy across multiple languages and cultures simultaneously. All of this knowledge existed primarily in the heads of people who had learned it by doing it within the Roman system. When the system collapsed, most of that knowledge went with it. This should make us think carefully about the knowledge embedded in our own complex institutions. A great deal of what makes modern societies function, the practical expertise of managing complex infrastructure, the institutional knowledge of how to run sophisticated financial systems, the accumulated experience of democratic governance, exists primarily as living practice within functioning institutions. It is not fully captured in books or databases. It lives in the habits and skills of people who learned it by doing it within systems that have been functioning continuously for long enough to develop that expertise. That knowledge is more fragile than it appears. Because the institutions that contain it are more fragile than they appear. The fourth lesson is about the pace of change and the difficulty of recognizing decline while it is happening. One of the most disorienting aspects of studying Rome's fall is the realization that the people living through it mostly did not understand what was happening. Not because they were stupid. Roman society produced writers, administrators, and military commanders of extraordinary intelligence throughout the period of decline, but because the decline was slow enough, and uneven enough, that it was genuinely difficult to distinguish the signal from the noise at any given moment. There were bad decades and then somewhat better decades. There were military disasters followed by remarkable recoveries. There were catastrophic emperors followed by competent ones. The trend was downward, but it was not a smooth or continuous descent. And at almost any point in the 3rd, 4th, or early 5th century, a reasonably optimistic Roman observer could have pointed to genuine reasons for hope. Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, placed the beginning of Rome's decline in the reign of Commodus, 180 AD. Other historians have placed it earlier or later. The honest answer is that there is no single moment when decline began. Because decline is not a moment. It is a direction, and directions are much easier to see in retrospect, from outside the experience of living through them, than they are to perceive from within. The people who lived through Rome's fall experienced it the way we experience most large historical processes, as a series of immediate crises, each demanding an immediate response, with the larger pattern visible only in hindsight if at all. A general in 410 AD was focused on stopping Alaric from sacking Rome, not on writing a theory of imperial decline. An emperor in 455 AD was trying to survive the next assassination attempt, not contemplating the structural forces that would end his dynasty. A farmer in Gaul in 476 AD probably did not know or care much about the document signed in Ravenna. He knew that the tax collector still came, that the roads were getting worse, that the soldiers who used to patrol the road had not been seen in some time. That life was harder than it had been for his grandfather. He did not have a name for what was happening. He was simply living it. This is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all. Because we are always living it. We are always inside our own historical moment, unable to see the full shape of the forces acting on us. Unable to distinguish the genuine turning points from the noise of daily events. Unable to know which of our current crises are temporary setbacks and which are symptoms of something structural and lasting. The Romans did not know they were Romans in decline. They thought they were Romans dealing with a difficult period that would eventually pass. As difficult periods always had before. The confidence that things would return to normal, that the system was fundamentally sound and would self-correct, was itself part of the problem. Because it justified the postponement of difficult reforms and the accommodation of destructive short-term interests. None of this means that collapse is inevitable for powerful civilizations, or that our own civilization is necessarily following the same trajectory as Rome. The differences between the Roman world and our own are real and significant. We have accumulated scientific and technical knowledge that the Romans lacked, stored in forms, books, digital records, global institutions, that are more resilient than the living traditions of the ancient world. We have democratic institutions and legal frameworks that, at their best, provide mechanisms for peaceful power transfer and accountability that the Roman system conspicuously lacked. We have, in the global trading system and the network of international institutions built after the Second World War, a degree of international economic and political coordination that has no Roman equivalent. But we also have, if we are honest, versions of the Roman failure modes. We have powerful groups whose short-term interests consistently override long-term collective needs. We have political systems that struggle to address problems whose consequences unfold over decades rather than election cycles. We have infrastructure that is aging and underfunded because the people who would benefit most from maintaining it are not the people who make the decisions about funding it. We have complex systems, financial, logistical, informational, whose interdependence makes them capable of extraordinary performance in normal times and extraordinary fragility under stress. We have, in short, the same basic tension between complexity and resilience, between the power that integration and specialization provide and the vulnerability that dependence on those systems creates. Rome's story does not tell us that we are doomed. History does not work that way. But it does tell us something important about the kinds of failures that can bring down powerful, sophisticated, apparently permanent systems, not through sudden catastrophic attack, but through the slow erosion of the institutional foundations that make those systems function. It tells us that the most dangerous threats are often internal rather than external, structural rather than dramatic, and slow enough that they are easy to explain away until they are no longer possible to ignore. It tells us that permanence is an illusion that every great civilization constructs for itself, and that the construction of that illusion is itself one of the mechanisms of decline, because a civilization that believes it cannot fall is a civilization that will not take seriously the early warning signs that it might. The eternal city was not eternal. That is not a counsel of despair. It is an invitation to pay attention to the health of institutions, to the distribution of sacrifice and benefit, to the gap between what a system promises and what it delivers, to the slow processes that rarely make headlines but that ultimately determine whether complex societies hold together or come apart. Rome fell. It took centuries. Most people who lived through it did not fully understand what was happening until it was over. What they left behind, the roads, the laws, the language, the manuscripts preserved in monastery libraries, the ruins that still stand in a dozen countries, shaped the world that came after them in ways they could not have imagined. That inheritance is still with us. In the legal systems of Europe and the Americas, in the Romance languages spoken by nearly 1 billion people, in the Catholic Church, the oldest continuously functioning institution in the Western world, which began as an illegal sect in a Roman province and outlasted the empire that tried to destroy it. In the very idea of universal law, the notion that every person, regardless of birth or power, deserves to be treated according to consistent, publicly stated rules, which Rome articulated imperfectly, failed to live up to repeatedly, but introduced into Western political thought as a standard against which governments could be measured and found wanting. The empire is gone. What it built, and what it broke, and what it left behind are still shaping the world. That is what 800 years of Roman history amounts to in the end, not a story of inevitable decline. Not a morality tale about the wages of excess. Not a simple lesson that can be summarized in a sentence. It is a vast, complicated, deeply human story about what people are capable of building together, about how long it takes to build something truly great, about how much faster it can be taken apart, and about how the things we create outlast us in ways we never fully anticipate. The dust of Rome is in the foundations of everything we have built since. It is worth knowing how it got there. Closing and call to action. On a warm afternoon in modern Rome, tourists walk across the same stones that Roman senators walked 2,000 years ago. They eat lunch in the shadow of the Colosseum. They throw coins into the Trevi fountain, built on the endpoint of an ancient aqueduct that once carried mountain water to a city of 1 million people. They take photographs and move on, mostly without thinking about what they are standing inside. They are standing inside the longest-running story in Western civilization. Everything around them, the language the Italians speak to each other, the legal system that governs the country, the Catholic Church whose dome dominates the skyline, the very grid of streets beneath their feet, is Rome. Not Rome as it was, frozen and preserved like an insect in amber. Rome as it became, transformed by 15 centuries of change into something new while remaining, at its deepest structural level, continuous with what came before. The fall of the Roman Empire was not the end of Rome. It was Rome changing form. The political entity died, the empire, the legions, the emperors, the senate, the grain dole, the gladiatorial games, all of that ended. Some of it quickly, most of it slowly, all of it permanently. But the thing Rome had actually built, the network of ideas, institutions, languages, laws, and physical structures that it had woven into the fabric of European civilization over 8 centuries, that did not die. It could not die, because it had become the foundation that everything else was built on. You cannot remove a foundation without bringing down the building. Europe did not remove the Roman foundation. It built on it, generation after generation. sometimes acknowledging the debt and sometimes forgetting it, but always standing on it. That is the final truth about Rome that matters most. Great civilizations do not simply disappear. They transform. They break apart and recombine. They lose their political form while their deeper contributions to language, to law, to technology, to ways of thinking about justice and governance and the organization of human life persist in the cultures that inherit them. Sometimes for millennia. Rome fell 15 centuries ago. Its influence on the world you woke up in this morning is so pervasive that it is almost invisible. The way the air is invisible, present everywhere, noticed almost nowhere, absolutely essential. Understanding that influence, tracing the lines that connect the world Rome built to the world we inhabit, is not merely an academic exercise. It is a way of understanding ourselves, where our institutions came from, why our laws are structured the way they are, why the languages of 1 billion people share the same ancient roots, why the city of Rome, which once held 1 million people and then shrank to 30,000 and then grew again over the centuries to nearly 3 million, still draws visitors from every corner of the planet who come, often without entirely knowing why, to stand among the ruins of something that shaped everything. History is not the past. History is the explanation of the present, and there is no better place to start that explanation than Rome, the city that built the world, lost itself, and left its bones in everything that followed. If this video gave you something, a new way of seeing a civilization you thought you knew, a question you had not thought to ask before, a sense of how deep the roots of our present world actually go, then it has done what it was made to do. Leave a comment below with the one thing from this story that stayed with you. Was it the image of Romulus Augustulus signing his abdication in a cold palace while the world moved on without him? Was it the realization that Rome did not fall in a day, or a year, or even a century, but through the slow accumulation of failures that no single person caused and no single person could stop? Was it the unsettling moment when the parallels to our own time became impossible to ignore? Whatever it was, write it down. The comment section of a video about Rome is, in its own small way, exactly the kind of conversation that Rome itself made possible. People separated by distance and language and culture, meeting in a shared space to talk about ideas that matter. That is a Roman invention. Use it. If you want to go deeper, if this 90 minutes left you wanting more rather than less, the description below has a reading list. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is the place serious readers start. 6 volumes of the most elegant historical prose in the English language. Brian Ward Perkins's The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization is shorter, sharper, and one of the best arguments for taking the collapse seriously rather than softening it into comfortable transformation. Peter Heather's The Fall of the Roman Empire gives the fullest account of the external pressures, the Huns, the Goths, the Vandals, and how they interacted with Rome's internal weaknesses. Adrian Goldsworthy's How Rome Fell focuses on the internal political failures, the endless cycle of civil war and assassination that drained the empire of exactly the leadership it needed most. Read them, argue with them, form your own view. That capacity, to read, to think critically, to form independent judgments about complex questions, is itself a Roman inheritance, transmitted through the educational traditions that Roman civilization established and that survived. In monasteries and cathedral schools and eventually universities, through the long centuries of the medieval period and into our own time. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. World Saga exists for one reason: to take the most important and fascinating stories in human history and tell them the way they deserve to be told, not as a list of dates and names, not as a parade of disconnected facts, but as what they actually are: human stories. Stories about people trying to build something that lasts, and failing, and leaving behind more than they knew. Next time, we go somewhere very different. Same ambition, same commitment to getting it right. A story that changed the world in ways that are still unfolding, and that most people know far less about than they think they do. History did not stop when Rome fell. It never stops. We will be here when you are ready for the next chapter.